Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. I used to believe my marriage was unshakable. Emily and I had been together for almost a decade, building a life that felt both stable and fulfilling. She was everything I had ever wanted in a partner. Smart, ambitious, and fiercely independent. We weren't perfect, of course, but I never doubted that we'd weather whatever challenges came our way. At least not until Richard entered the picture. Emily worked as a corporate lawyer for a high-profile firm in the city. Her career had always been demanding, but she thrived under pressure. I'd seen her conquer deals that would make most people crumble, her quick wit and sharp mind cutting through the noise like a blade. I was proud of her success and the respect she commanded in her field. It wasn't until the firm announced a new CEO that I began to see changes in her. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore as time went on. Richard Stone. His name alone carried a weight that felt palpable when Emily first mentioned it over dinner one evening. "He's brilliant," she said, her eyes lighting up as she swirled her wine glass. "I mean, he's turned around 3 companies in less than a decade. Everyone's saying he's exactly what we need." I nodded, not thinking much of it. CEOs came and went in her world, and while they often made an impression, Emily had always been focused on her own work. But there was something different in the way she spoke about him. It wasn't just admiration. It was reverence. "What's he like?" I asked, curious but not alarmed. Emily hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Intense," she said finally. "He's charismatic, but not in an overbearing way. It's like he just knows how to command a room without even trying. People listen to him. They want to." Her description sent a small ripple of unease through me, though I brushed it aside. I trusted Emily implicitly. She'd always been open about her work, and I'd never had reason to question her loyalty. Still, as the weeks passed, Richard became a recurring topic of conversation, more so than any other colleague she'd ever mentioned. "Richard wants to restructure the entire department," she said one evening, setting her laptop on the coffee table. She'd been working late more often, her usual balance between work and home tipping noticeably in favor of the former. "It's ambitious, but if it works, it'll be huge for the company." "Sounds like he's keeping you busy," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. Emily glanced at me, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "I know I've been distracted," she said, moving to sit beside me on the couch. "But this is a big opportunity for me, too. If I can prove myself to him, it could mean a lot for my career." Her words made sense, but they didn't ease the growing distance I felt between us. Emily had always been ambitious, but she'd never let her work consume her like this before. Late nights turned into weekends at the office, and even when she was home, her mind seemed elsewhere. I tried to be supportive, telling myself it was just a phase, but the nagging feeling in my gut refused to subside. The first time I met Richard in person was at a firm event. Emily had insisted I come, saying it would be a good chance for me to meet some of her colleagues. When we arrived, the room buzzed with energy, a mix of polished professionals and high-end decor creating an atmosphere that felt more like a gala than a corporate gathering. Richard stood near the center of the room, effortlessly commanding attention. He was tall, with a confident posture and an easy smile that somehow seemed calculated. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, exuding wealth and power. But it was his eyes that struck me the most, sharp and piercing, as if he could see straight through you. "So this is the famous husband," he said when Emily introduced us, his handshake firm and deliberate. There was a charm to his voice, smooth and disarming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a performance. "Nice to meet you," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "Emily speaks very highly of you," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to her. "It's good to see a couple that supports each other's ambitions." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Throughout the evening, I watched as he and Emily interacted, their conversations fluid and easy, like they were speaking a language only they understood. I told myself it was just professional chemistry, but the knot in my chest refused to loosen. As the event wound down, I couldn't help but notice the way Emily looked at Richard. It wasn't blatant, but there was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. I wanted to believe it was admiration, the kind she'd shown for mentors and colleagues in the past. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Driving home that night, Emily was animated, recounting conversations and plans for upcoming projects. I listened, nodding in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. For the first time in our marriage, I felt a flicker of doubt, a sense that something I couldn't quite name had shifted between us. I told myself I was overreacting. Emily loved me and I loved her. We'd built a life together, one that was strong and resilient. But as I glanced at her in the passenger seat, her face glowing with excitement that had nothing to do with me, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping into my thoughts. Richard Stone had entered our lives like a storm, and though I didn't know it yet, he was about to change everything. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Emily had always been meticulous about her work, but now it consumed her. Late nights turned into early mornings, her laptop became a permanent fixture on the dining room table, and her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. I told myself it was just the nature of her job. High stakes, high pressure, but the nagging discomfort in the pit of my stomach refused to go away. The first real argument we had about it came on a Wednesday evening. Emily had texted earlier to say she'd be late. Again. By the time she got home, I'd already eaten dinner alone, the food I'd cooked for us congealing on her untouched plate. She breezed in, still on a call, mouthing an apology as she waved at me. I watched her pace the living room, heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she spoke in low, urgent tones. It was another 20 minutes before she finally hung up and noticed the tension in the room. "Hey," she said, her tone cautious. "Sorry about that. It's been a crazy day." "Lately, every day has been a crazy day," I replied, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. She sighed, setting her bag down. "I know it's been a lot, but this is just temporary. Richard has these big plans for the firm, and we're all pulling extra weight to make it happen." "Richard," I said, the name coming out sharper than I intended. "Seems like he's taking up all your time these days." Emily's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said quickly, though the words didn't feel true even as I said them. "It's just, I feel like I never see you anymore. You're always at work, or on your phone, or talking about him." "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising. "You know how important this is for my career. I thought you supported me." "I do support you," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "But it feels like your career is the only thing that matters anymore." Emily stared at me for a long moment, her expression a mix of guilt and defensiveness. "I'm doing this for us," she said finally. "You know that, right?" I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that the long hours and missed dinners were just a phase, a necessary sacrifice for the life we were building together. But the way she avoided my gaze told me there was more to the story. The tension between us lingered in the days that followed. Emily tried to make up for it in small ways, bringing home my favorite coffee, suggesting a movie night, but the distance between us had already taken root. It was as though we were speaking different languages, each trying to bridge a gap that only seemed to widen with every passing day. Then came the firm's charity gala. Emily had been talking about it for weeks, detailing the plans with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in a while. "Richard wants it to be perfect," she said one evening as she scrolled through dress options on her tablet. "He's so hands-on with these kinds of things." The way she said his name made my jaw tighten, though I forced a smile. "Sounds like a big deal," I said. "It is," she replied, glancing up at me. "You're coming, right?" "Of course," I said, though the prospect of spending an evening watching her orbit around Richard didn't exactly fill me with excitement. The night of the gala, Emily looked stunning. She wore a sleek black gown that hugged her figure, her hair swept up to reveal the delicate curve of her neck. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as I watched her glide through the crowd, effortlessly charming everyone she spoke to. But that pride was tempered by a gnawing sense of inadequacy, a feeling that I was an outsider in her world. Richard arrived late, making an entrance that drew everyone's attention. He moved through the room like a king surveying his court, his presence magnetic and commanding. When he reached our table, Emily's face lit up in a way that made my chest tighten. "Emily," he said, his voice smooth and rich. "You look radiant." She blushed, her smile widening. "Thank you, Richard. You clean up pretty well yourself." The exchange was brief, but it left a bitter taste in my mouth. Throughout the evening, I watched as Richard and Emily interacted, their conversations punctuated by laughter and shared glances. I tried to join in, but it was clear that I didn't belong in their world. The more I watched, the more I felt like an intruder in my own marriage. By the time we got home, I was simmering with resentment. Emily, oblivious to my mood, kicked off her heels and sank onto the couch with a contented sigh. "That went well, don't you think?" she said. "Sure," I replied, my tone clipped. She frowned, sitting up. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said, though the word felt like a lie. "Just tired." Emily studied me for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I know things have been hectic lately, but I need you to trust me. This is just work. That's all it is." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that her words were true. But the knot in my chest told me otherwise. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard Stone was at the center of it all. The distance between us grew wider, yet neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge it outright. Emily buried herself deeper into work, and I convinced myself that it was just a phase, a stressful period we'd eventually move past. But the truth was harder to ignore when the signs started showing up in small, almost imperceptible ways. It began with the phone. Emily had always been attached to her devices, but now her phone seemed like an extension of her hand. She'd turned the screen away when I walked into the room, her thumbs flying across the glass in a way that felt furtive. I told myself it was nothing. She worked in corporate law. Sensitive information came with the territory. But the unease inside me refused to settle. Then there was the shift in her wardrobe. Emily had always dressed professionally, favoring tailored suits and modest heels. Lately, though, her outfits seemed a little too carefully chosen, her skirts a fraction shorter, her blouses a touch more revealing. When I commented on it, trying to make it sound like a compliment, she laughed it off, saying she just wanted to feel more confident at work. "Richard has been pushing everyone hard," she explained one evening as she applied lipstick in the hallway mirror. "Sometimes, it helps to look the part." The word stung, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't as if she hadn't always taken pride in her appearance. But this felt different, deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl. It was at the firm's monthly cocktail hour that the unease crystallized into something sharper. Emily had insisted I come along, saying it would be good for me to meet more of her colleagues. I agreed, mostly out of a desire to understand the world she seemed so consumed by. The event was held at an upscale bar downtown, the kind of place where the drinks were overpriced and the clientele impossibly polished. Emily looked stunning as always, her dress hugging her figure in a way that made heads turn when we walked in. I was proud to be by her side, but that pride was tinged with something darker, a creeping sense of inadequacy. We were barely through the door when Richard appeared, his presence commanding the room even before he spoke. He greeted Emily first, his hand lingering on hers just a moment too long. My stomach tightened at the sight, but I forced myself to smile as he turned to me. "Good to see you again," he said, his handshake firm and confident. "Emily tells me you've been busy with some home projects?" I nodded, caught off guard by the personal question. "Just small stuff. Nothing exciting." Richard smiled, his eyes sharp. "Sometimes the small stuff matters most." The conversation moved on quickly, but the exchange left me unsettled. Throughout the evening, I couldn't help but notice the way Richard's hand brushed against Emily's arm when he spoke to her. The way their heads leaned closer together than seemed necessary. It wasn't overt, just a series of small, almost accidental touches. But each one felt like a knife twisting in my gut. At one point, I excused myself to get a drink, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. From the bar, I had a clear view of them standing together, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the overhead lights. Emily was laughing at something Richard had said, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. The sight made my heart pound, a mix of anger and helplessness flooding my chest. When I returned, Emily's demeanor shifted. She seemed to sense my mood, her laughter fading as she reached for my hand. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The ride home was quiet, the air between us heavy with unspoken tension. Emily tried to fill the silence with small talk, but I couldn't bring myself to respond with more than a few monosyllabic answers. My mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the evening in excruciating detail. That night, as Emily slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The doubts I'd been trying to suppress were no longer whispers in the back of my mind. They were a roar impossible to ignore. Something was happening between Emily and Richard. I couldn't prove it, not yet, but the seeds of suspicion had taken root. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I needed to trust her. But deep down, I knew that the accidental touches were anything but accidental. They were the beginnings of something I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. The evidence was piling up, though it wasn't concrete enough to confront her. Emily's late nights at the office had become routine, her explanations rehearsed and delivered with a breezy confidence that only deepened my suspicion. I wanted to believe her, to trust the woman I'd built a life with, but the doubts gnawed at me, growing louder with every unanswered question. Then I found the receipt. It was tucked between the pages of a legal pad she'd left on the dining room table, an afterthought in her rush to leave for work that morning. I wasn't looking for anything incriminating when I flipped through it, but the narrow strip of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, my pulse quickening as I scanned the details. A high-end restaurant downtown, 2 entrees, a bottle of wine that cost more than our weekly grocery bill. The date was 2 nights ago, a night she'd claimed to be working late on a merger deal. I stared at the receipt for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a work dinner. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. I'd been to that restaurant with Emily once before, and I remembered her saying it was too romantic for a casual meal. When she came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room, the receipt folded neatly on the coffee table. She looked tired but radiant, her makeup still flawless despite the long hours she'd supposedly spent at the office. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "You're up late." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "How was work?" "Busy," she said, running a hand through her hair. "But we're making progress." "That's good," I said, nodding toward the coffee table. "What about dinner 2 nights ago? Was that productive too?" Her eyes flicked to the receipt, her expression freezing for a fraction of a second before she forced a smile. "Oh, it was just a client meeting. Richard thought it would be better to discuss things over dinner than in the office." "Richard?" I repeated, the name bitter on my tongue. "It seems like you two spend a lot of time together." Emily's smile faltered, replaced by a look of annoyance. "He's my boss," she said, her tone defensive. "Of course we spend time together. That's how these things work." "And the wine?" I pressed, unable to stop myself. "That's part of how these things work too?" Her eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. "Are you seriously accusing me of something right now?" I hesitated, my anger battling with the part of me that still wanted to trust her. "I'm just trying to understand," I said finally. "It feels like you're keeping things from me." Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm not keeping anything from you. I'm working my ass off to support us, and all you can do is sit here and go through my things." Her words stung, but I couldn't back down. "I'm not imagining this," I said, my voice low. "Something's changed, Emily. You've changed." She shook her head, grabbing the receipt and stuffing it into her bag. "I'm not doing this with you right now," she said, turning toward the bedroom. "I've had a long day, and I don't need this." I watched her walk away, my chest tight with frustration and helplessness. She wasn't even trying to reassure me anymore, and that spoke louder than any denial could. The following week, I couldn't shake the image of that receipt or the way she dismissed my concerns. I started paying closer attention, noting the times she left the house, the excuses she gave for staying late. It wasn't long before I had my answer. It was a Saturday afternoon when I decided to follow her. She told me she was meeting a colleague for lunch to go over some final details on a case. I waited 10 minutes after she left before grabbing my keys and heading out. My heart pounded as I trailed her car through the city, my palms slick against the steering wheel. She parked in front of the same restaurant from the receipt, stepping out of the car with an air of practiced confidence. I stayed back, watching as she walked inside. Minutes later, Richard arrived, his presence as commanding as ever. They greeted each other with smiles that felt too familiar, too intimate. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Watching them through the window, their heads bent close together as they talked, was enough to confirm what I'd already suspected. This wasn't just work. This was something else entirely. When Emily came home later that evening, she acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and settled onto the couch with her laptop. I played along, my anger simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't time to confront her, not yet, but the cracks in our marriage were no longer invisible, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. It was a week after I followed Emily to the restaurant. I had said nothing, done nothing, just let the knowledge fester inside me. My mind ran in circles, questioning, doubting, rationalizing, and condemning her actions and my own inaction. I was trapped in a prison of uncertainty, unable to confront her without proof that couldn't be dismissed with a wave of her hand. Then I saw the confirmation I had been dreading. Emily had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to shower. It wasn't locked, a rare occurrence that made me hesitate for only a moment. My hands trembled as I picked it up, navigating to her messages. Most were mundane chats with colleagues, reminders for meetings, and texts from friends. But when I saw Richard's name, my heart sank. I opened the thread, my breath catching as I read the words on the screen. Richard, can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible. Emily, same. I can't believe we took that risk, but I don't regret it. Richard, neither do I. Every moment with you is worth it. I stared at the messages, my chest tight with a mixture of anger, heartbreak, and something that felt disturbingly like relief. I finally had the truth. There was no denying it now, no way for her to spin it into an innocent misunderstanding. She was sleeping with him. The shower stopped, the sound of water replaced by the muffled rustle of a towel. I quickly set the phone back on the counter, my hands shaking as I stepped away. My mind raced. Should I confront her now? Wait for more proof? Or could I even handle the fallout? Emily emerged moments later, her hair damp and her expression calm, as if nothing had changed. She gave me a small smile as she poured herself a glass of wine, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I watched her, wondering how she could look so serene, so unaffected, while everything we'd built was crumbling before my eyes. Long day? She asked, leaning against the counter. You could say that, I replied, my voice tight. She tilted her head, studying me. You've seemed off lately. Is everything okay? The irony of her question almost made me laugh. Instead, I forced a smile. Just work stress. Nothing to worry about. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and went about her evening as if everything was perfectly normal. The following day, I left work early and drove to her office building. I parked across the street, watching the entrance like a private investigator in a cheap noir film. Hours passed before I finally saw her. She wasn't alone. Emily stepped out of the building with Richard at her side, her laugh carrying across the pavement as they walked toward a nearby hotel. My stomach churned as I watched them disappear through the revolving doors, their ease and familiarity a slap in the face. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm into the hotel, to confront them in the middle of their rendezvous and demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, paralyzed by a mix of fear and fury. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that they emerged, their expressions relaxed and their movements unhurried. Richard's hand rested on the small of her back as they walked back toward the office. A gesture so intimate it made my stomach turn. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay put until they were out of sight. That evening, Emily came home late again, her excuses the same as always. I could barely look at her, my anger simmering just below the surface. Every word she spoke felt like a lie, every smile a mockery of the trust we'd once shared. She kissed me goodnight, her lips brushing mine with a casualness that felt like a betrayal in itself. As she turned off the light and settled into bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how much longer I could endure this charade. I had seen enough. The next time she left the house, I would follow her again. And this time I wouldn't stop at simply watching. I would demand the truth no matter how much it hurt to hear it. Emily's absences became a familiar ache in my daily life, a wound that refused to heal. She was gone more than she was home now, her excuses well practiced and delivered with an air of nonchalance that might have convinced me if I didn't already know the truth. Still, I said nothing, choosing instead to bide my time and gather the courage to confront her. I wasn't ready yet. The nights were the worst. She would slip into bed hours after me, smelling faintly of his cologne, though she made no effort to hide it anymore. I would lie there, stiff as a board, pretending to be asleep while my mind spiraled into the abyss. My dreams were no reprieve either. They were haunted by images of her with him, their bodies entwined, their laughter mocking me. One Saturday morning, she left under the pretense of an urgent meeting at the office. "Richard wants to go over the quarterly reports before Monday," she explained, brushing her hair into a sleek ponytail. "I shouldn't be gone too long." I nodded, unable to muster more than a strained, "Okay." She kissed me on the cheek and walked out the door without a backward glance. Once she was gone, I sprang into action. I'd downloaded a tracking app onto her phone weeks ago, a decision that had filled me with equal parts shame and resolve. Now, I pulled up the app on my own phone, watching the blinking that represented her car. It moved steadily through the city before stopping in front of a boutique hotel. The same hotel. I clenched my teeth, fury bubbling up as I stared at the screen. I grabbed my keys and drove there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, I parked a block away and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two, the weight of my anger growing heavier with each passing moment. Finally, she emerged, her arm linked with his. Richard's hand lingered on her waist as he guided her toward his car, their movements casual and unhurried, as if they had nothing to hide. My vision blurred with rage as I watched them drive off, my hands trembling as I resisted the urge to follow them. Instead, I went home, the anger festering inside me like a living thing. By the time Emily returned, I was on the verge of exploding. She walked through the door, her smile bright and her tone cheerful as she greeted me. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her bag on the counter. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "Yours?" "Busy," she replied, grabbing a glass of water. "Richard's been pushing everyone hard lately, but it's paying off. We're ahead of schedule on the reports." I forced a smile, though it felt like a mask. "Glad to hear it." She didn't notice the edge in my voice or the tension in my posture. Or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. Either way, the moment passed, and she moved on, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. The days blurred together after that, each one a monotonous cycle of deceit and denial. Emily's lies became more elaborate, her alibis more rehearsed. And I let her have them, my silence serving as a buffer between us. But the space between us was growing, an ever-widening chasm that I didn't know how to bridge. One evening, I caught her texting while we were watching a movie. Her phone screen glowed softly in the dim light, the faintest hint of a smile playing on her lips as she typed. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She glanced at me, her expression unflinching. "Just Monica from work. She's asking about the presentation slides for tomorrow." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach tightened. Her lies were so smooth, so effortless. It was as if she'd convinced herself they weren't lies at all. Later that night, I checked her phone while she was in the shower. The text wasn't from Monica. It was from Richard. Richard, can't wait to see you tomorrow. Let's plan something special afterward. Emily, I'll find a way to make it work. Looking forward to it. I set the phone down, my hands shaking as I stared at the bathroom door. The sound of running water mocked me, a reminder of how normal everything seemed on the surface. But beneath the facade, our marriage was rotting, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The truth was, I didn't just want answers anymore. I wanted revenge. I had reached the edge of my patience. The days of passive observation and quiet suffering were over. Emily's lies had become so ingrained in her routine that she didn't even bother to hide them anymore. I could see it in her casual excuses, the way her phone would vibrate with work notifications, and the faint scent of his cologne lingering on her clothes. It was as if she no longer cared whether I noticed. Or worse, she assumed I wouldn't confront her. But I wasn't the only one who had noticed. One evening, I received an email from a blocked address. The subject line read, "Do you know what she's been up to?" My stomach clenched as I opened it. Inside was a single photo attachment. Emily and Richard in the lobby of a hotel, their bodies close and their hands entwined. The timestamp confirmed what I already suspected. She wasn't at work that night. She was with him. Beneath the photo was a short message. "She's risking more than just your marriage. Let's talk." My fingers hovered over the reply button, anger and curiosity warring within me. Who was this? What did they want? After a moment, I typed a simple response. "Who are you?" The reply came within minutes. "Someone who knows the truth. Meet me at the coffee shop on 8th and Main tomorrow at noon." Alone. I spent the night tossing and turning, my mind racing with possibilities. By the time morning came, I'd resolved to go. I needed answers, not just about Emily and Richard, but about who else might know their secret. The coffee shop was quiet when I arrived, the hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine blending into a soothing background noise. I scanned the room, my heart pounding, until a woman in a sharp navy blazer caught my eye. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun and a guarded expression. When our eyes met, she gestured for me to sit across from her. "You must be Emily's husband," she said, her voice low but steady. "Who are you?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "Monica," she replied, extending a hand that I ignored. "I work with Emily and Richard, and I've seen more than I care to." I stared at her, my skepticism evident. "Why are you telling me this? What's in it for you?" She smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Straight to the point. I like that. The truth is, I've been watching them for months. I know about their affair, but I also know how reckless they've been. It's putting the company at risk, and that's something I can't ignore." "So this is about your job," I said, my voice laced with contempt. "Not about helping me." Monica's expression hardened. "It's about both. You deserve to know what's happening in your own marriage. And She hesitated, then continued, "I need leverage. Richard's been sabotaging people to cover his tracks, and Emily's too deep to see what he's doing. If I go to HR, they'll bury it. But if you expose them, they'll have no choice but to act." I leaned forward, my anger barely contained. "And what makes you think I want to help you?" "Because you're here," she said simply. Monica handed me a folder before we parted ways. "This is everything I've collected. Emails, receipts, photos. Use it however you see fit." At home, I opened the folder with trembling hands. The contents were damning. Hotel reservations under fake names, explicit emails between Emily and Richard, even a recording of a phone call where they discussed fabricating work obligations to cover their tracks. It was worse than I'd imagined. But the folder wasn't just incriminating, it was dangerous. It revealed how Richard had manipulated Emily into signing off on questionable deals, ones that could bring legal trouble if exposed. She wasn't just his lover. She was his accomplice. That night, I confronted Emily. She came home late, her face flushed from what I could only assume was another rendezvous with Richard. She barely had time to put her bag down before I threw the folder onto the dining table. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary as she flipped it open, her face drained of color as she scanned the documents. "Where did you get this? Does it matter?" I shot back, my voice trembling with rage. "You lied to me, Emily, over and over, and now you've dragged yourself into something even worse. Do you even understand what you've done?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. For once, she was speechless. "I know about the affair," I continued, my voice breaking. "I know about the deals, about Richard. I know everything." Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't feel pity, only fury. "I trusted you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I believed in you, and this is how you repay me." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know how to stop." "Stop," I snapped. "You didn't want to stop. Don't lie to me, Emily. Not anymore." She crumpled into a chair, her head in her hands. I stood there, my chest heaving, unsure of what to do next. The weight of her betrayal was suffocating. But so was the realization that this was only the beginning. Monica's warning echoed in my mind. "She's risking more than just your marriage." The days after my confrontation with Emily were a haze of silence and avoidance. She had begged for forgiveness, pleaded with me to let her explain, but I couldn't bring myself to hear her out. The betrayal had lodged itself deep in my chest, an ache that refused to subside. Yet beneath the anger and heartbreak, a new determination had taken hold. I needed to know everything. Emily's behavior changed after that night. She came home earlier, avoided her phone when I was in the room, and tried to engage me in conversations that felt forced and hollow. But her sudden transparency only deepened my suspicion. I knew she wasn't telling me the whole truth. She couldn't, not with Richard still looming over both of us like a dark cloud. Couldn't let it go. I started digging deeper into the folder Monica had given me, piecing together the timeline of Emily and Richard's affair. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how calculated Richard had been from the start. He had charmed her, drawn her into his web of power and influence, and used her position to push through questionable deals that served his interests. Emily wasn't just complicit, she was a pawn. But there was more. Hidden among the emails and receipts was a chain of correspondence that hinted at something far more sinister. Richard had been planning to shift blame onto Emily for a series of fraudulent transactions. If the truth came out, she would be the one left holding the bag, while he walked away unscathed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had never cared about her. She wasn't his partner. She was his scapegoat. I didn't confront Emily right away. I needed more proof, something irrefutable that would expose Richard for who he truly was. Monica became my reluctant ally in this endeavor. We met in secret, sharing information and strategizing how to bring Richard down without dragging Emily completely under with him. "We need to get him on record," Monica said one evening, her voice low as we huddled in a dimly lit diner. "If we can catch him admitting to the fraud or his plans for Emily, we'll have enough to force the board to act." "How do we do that?" I asked, my frustration evident. "He's not going to just confess." She hesitated, then slid a small recording device across the table. "He will if he thinks he's untouchable. Emily might be the key to making that happen." The idea made my stomach churn. Involving Emily felt like crossing a line, but I couldn't deny the logic. She was the one person Richard trusted completely, the only one who could get him to lower his guard. That night, I waited for Emily to come home. She looked surprised to find me sitting in the living room, the folder of evidence spread out on the coffee table. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. She hesitated, then nodded, sinking into the armchair opposite me. "Okay, I'm listening." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I know about Richard's plans. He's using you, Emily. The deals, the emails, all of it. He's setting you up to take the fall when everything comes crashing down." Her face paled, her eyes widening as she processed my words. What are you talking about? Richard would never. Don't defend him, I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. You know I'm right. You've seen the signs, haven't you? She looked away, tears pooling in her eyes. I didn't want to believe it, she admitted. But lately some things haven't added up. The deals he's been pushing, the way he's been handling the board. He's using you, I said again, my voice softening. And if we don't stop him, he'll ruin you. Emily's shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We get him to confess, I said, sliding the recording device toward her. You're the only one who can make that happen. Her eyes widened in shock. You want me to trap him? I want you to protect yourself, I said firmly. This isn't just about our marriage anymore, Emily. This is about your career, your freedom. He won't hesitate to destroy you if it means saving himself. She stared at the device for a long moment, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. Finally, she nodded. I'll do it. The plan was risky, but it worked. Emily arranged a meeting with Richard under the guise of discussing their next move. I listened to the recording later, my heart pounding as his arrogance spilled out in every word. Don't worry about the paperwork, Richard said, his tone dismissive. If anything goes wrong, we'll pin it on you. That's what you're here for, isn't it? To keep me safe. Emily played her part perfectly, feigning agreement while steering the conversation deeper into his web of deceit. By the end of the meeting, we had everything we needed. The fallout was swift and brutal. Monica and I presented the evidence to the board, ensuring there was no way they could sweep it under the rug. Richard was forced to resign, his reputation in tatters. Emily's involvement didn't go unnoticed, but the recording painted her as a victim rather than an accomplice. She kept her job, but the scandal left a stain on her career that would take years to erase. As for us, the damage was already done. Exposing Richard had brought us a hollow kind of justice, but it couldn't undo the betrayal or erase the pain. Emily and I were left to pick up the pieces of a marriage that felt irreparably broken. The weeks following Richard's downfall felt like navigating a minefield. The scandal had erupted like a bomb, leaving Emily and me standing in the rubble of our lives. Though the immediate threat had been neutralized, the damage was far from contained. Emily had thrown herself into damage control at work, attempting to salvage what little was left of her reputation. Late nights and hushed phone calls were once again the norm, but this time I didn't bother asking where she was, or who she was speaking to. The truth no longer mattered. Our marriage had become a hollow shell, held together by little more than shared memories and mutual exhaustion. It was a Thursday night when the final crack appeared. Emily came home late, her steps tentative as she entered the living room. I was sitting on the couch, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the TV without really seeing it. She stood in the doorway, her posture stiff and her expression unreadable. We need to talk, she said finally. I took a sip of my drink, savoring the burn before setting the glass down. I figured this was coming, I said, my voice flat. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I don't know how to start this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Try the truth, I said, leaning back against the cushions. That would be a nice change. Her eyes flicked to mine, guilt and pain swirling in their depths. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. For everything. For the lies. For Richard. For all of it. Is that supposed to make it better? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. No, she said quickly. I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I was stupid and selfish, and I let things spiral out of control. But I never stopped loving you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let her see the effect they had. You have a funny way of showing it, I said bitterly. She flinched but pressed on. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But we can't keep going like this. It's killing both of us. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. The anger, the resentment, the endless cycle of blame and regret. It was toxic. We were toxic. But acknowledging it didn't make the decision any easier. So what are you saying? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. I think we need to end this. For both our sakes. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing left. If that's what you want, I said finally, my voice hollow. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. It's not what I want, she said, her voice breaking. But it's what we need. The next few days were a blur of painful conversations and logistical nightmares. Dividing our lives into neat little boxes felt like dissecting a corpse, each item a reminder of what we'd lost. We avoided the topic of Richard altogether, as if saying his name would somehow make everything worse. Emily moved out first, taking a small apartment closer to her office. The night she left, I stood at the window and watched her car disappear down the street, the realization of finality hitting me like a freight train. I was alone now, truly alone, and the silence of the house was suffocating. A week later, I received an email from Monica. The subject line read, "Final update." Curious, I opened it to find a link to an article about Richard. He hadn't just resigned, he was under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and a laundry list of other charges. The article painted a grim picture of a man who had fallen from grace, his reputation and career destroyed beyond repair. I stared at the screen, a bitter satisfaction coursing through me. Richard was finally paying for his sins, but it didn't feel like enough. It wouldn't bring back the life he'd stolen from me, the marriage he'd helped destroy. That night, I poured myself another glass of whiskey and sat alone in the dark, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Emily was gone, Richard was ruined, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. Breaking up had felt inevitable, but it didn't make it hurt any less. The divorce process was as brutal as the betrayal that had led to it. Emily and I hadn't spoken since the night she left, and now our conversations were filtered through lawyers and mediators. Each meeting was another wound, another reminder of how far we'd fallen. At first, I had no intention of making things public. I didn't want the world to know the sordid details of our failed marriage or the role Richard had played in its destruction. But as the proceedings dragged on, Emily's lawyer pushed for terms that felt like an insult. She wanted the house, a significant portion of my savings, and alimony, as if her choices hadn't already cost me enough. That was when I decided to fight back. The courtroom was a cold, sterile place, its walls echoing with the sounds of shuffling papers and hushed conversations. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my lawyer by my side, while Emily sat across from me. She looked tired, her once pristine appearance now marred by sleepless nights and the weight of public scrutiny. The press had caught wind of Richard's downfall, and by extension, Emily's involvement. Though her name wasn't in the headlines, whispers of her connection to the scandal had begun to circulate. As the hearing began, my lawyer presented the evidence I'd gathered. The receipts, the emails, the recording of Richard's plans to use Emily as his scapegoat. I'd been reluctant to air our dirty laundry in such a public setting, but it was the only way to protect what little I had left. The judge listened intently, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. Emily's lawyer tried to shift the narrative, painting her as a victim of Richard's manipulation. There was truth to it. Even I couldn't deny that Richard had used her, but it didn't absolve her of the choices she'd made. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she looked directly at me, her voice steady but tinged with regret. I made mistakes, she admitted. I let myself be drawn into something I couldn't control. But I never wanted to hurt him. I never wanted any of this. Her words struck a chord, but they couldn't erase the damage. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The assets would be divided fairly, with no alimony awarded to either party. The house would be sold, and the proceeds split. It was a fair outcome, but it felt like a hollow victory. There was no winning in a situation like this. After the hearing, I stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, the weight of the proceedings still heavy on my shoulders. Emily was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed against the chill. For a moment, I considered walking past her without a word, but something held me back. "This isn't how I wanted it to end," she said softly, her breath visible in the cold. "Neither did I," I replied, my voice devoid of anger. "But it's where we are." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," I said, and for the first time I meant it. We stood there in silence, two people who had once shared everything now reduced to strangers. Finally, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The months that followed were a blur of rebuilding. I moved into a smaller apartment, sold the house, and focused on putting my life back together. The pain didn't disappear, but it dulled with time, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. Richard's trial made headlines for weeks, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. Emily's name was never mentioned, but I knew she carried the scars of their affair as deeply as I did. We were both trying to heal, each in our own way. One evening, I found myself at the same coffee shop where Monica and I had first met. As I sipped my drink, I thought about the man I'd been when this all began. Naive, trusting, and utterly unprepared for the storm that had torn through my life. I wasn't that man anymore. I was stronger now, scarred but still standing. As I left the coffee shop, I looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly against the darkness. For the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. The betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. And as I walked away, I realized that I was finally ready to start again. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.